Kia ora. Kia ora koutou katoa. So I'm going to talk about the last 100 years of music on the North Shore, mainly as just a window to look at music history over the last 100 years. The thing I'm obsessed about at the moment that I'm trying to write an article on is how alcohol laws affected music in Aotearoa. And so that'll come up different times. I mean, yeah, so I might overemphasize that, but that's just because I'm slightly obsessed with that at the moment. Does anyone know where this first photo is taken? Milford, yes, this was Milford. Before they built the marina, they had a swimming pool that would fill up with seawater that you could swim. And then over there on the left is the ye olde pirate ship, yeah, where bands played. So it's just sort of life before 1967 when the alcohol laws changed. So these first few venues are places where you couldn't buy alcohol, more like restaurants and halls and so forth. The reason I start with this is because how North Shore began as far as music. I mean, there were certain Maori tribes that lived there over time, but it was actually quite a transitional place, I think, because of the volcanoes there, not just the two mountains, but also Pupuki is a volcano, Tank Farm is a volcano, so it was very rocky volcanic soil. So I think Maori tribes moved through there. None of them have managed to make a Treaty of Waitangi claim, so I'm not going to try and cover any music, pre-European music. But what Milford was in the early 1900s, it was the music hub of North Shore because it was like a tourist spot. Basically, people would catch a ferry over for the day and hang out, which is why something so extravagant like this could be built. When they first started though, back in the 20s, it was really movie theatres. They'd be double use kind of venues. This is the Picturedrome in the heart of Milford. It was owned by Laurie Speedy, who was like a crazy promoter, who was basically they'd run it as a cinema till 10, and then as his son describes, the picture would finish at 10, a false ceiling was lowered and hundreds of lights and lanterns appeared, producing an effect like fairyland. And they'd sweep up or any dust and rubbish, and then they'd move the chairs aside and they'd just have a dance hall. So there'd be a band playing there. And then further up, so that was 1922, he first started that venue. Up the road was the Green Mill Theatre, which was started by Mr. Putty Brown, but was also built out, taken over by Laurie Speedy as well as a venue and a cinema. It was actually originally called the Bridgeway, but it's nothing to do with the Harbour Bridge. It was the Wairau Creek Bridge at the end of Milford. So that's what they referred to. Meanwhile, down in Browns Bay, you had a similar thing. But even more rundown. I mean, Browns Bay at that point, it was all just fields, really. It was like a farming sort of place. But this is the main road of, the bottom picture shows the main road of Browns Bay, basically. And at the southern end, there's still a river over the bottom. So you can sort of see where that river is, where the bridge is. That's where the 555 Theatre and Cabaret was. So that was a similar kind of era. It was really more like a barn. It was like people would just go in there like this with just loose chairs, watch cinema, move the chairs aside and dance. So it's very kind of rustic. But to give you a sense of the ads for these sort of places, that's the Green Mill up there. The Picturedrome at Milford will hold the usual 2 hours dancing after the picture every Wednesday and Saturday from 10 till midnight. A good orchestra will be in attendance and late buses will run to Devonport. A plain and fancy dress ball will be held this evening by the Burlington Dance Club, Dominion Hall, Dominion Road. That's in separate. But this ad, the one on the far right, really shows Laurie Speedy's kind of peppy entrepreneurial spirit. When the pleasure-seeking holiday makers foregather at the famous Drome to join in the most remarkable New Year's Eve celebrations held in New Zealand. For this exciting annual occasion, Gladys Swarth and Fred McMurray start the ball rolling in glamorous Vienna romance, gay as bubbling wine, and so on and so forth. So he's very sort of like self-promoting. The Green Mill burned down in 1934, and we'll talk about more what happened to the Picturedrome as we go along. But you can sort of get a sense of that Milford sort of being a holiday makers party area. And of course, that led to the building of the pirate ship in 1929, which we discussed at the top. So you can see it's quite amazing. It really was built in the shape of a pirate ship. It even had the like shutters like a pirate ship to the outside. Inside there are cutlasses on the wall, and the band would play with this like picture of rigging behind them and all the setup with the skull and crossbones. In 1936, they made that swimming pool to go along with it. So it was really an exciting sort of place to go. Across the other side of the island was the Takapuna Boating Club, which was built in 1923. The government gifted the land to the boating club to build this boating club. It's Bayswater, really, more than Takapuna. And how did you get around? Here's one of the ferries that you catch across. I think that's the Pupuki. So that'd go to Bayswater, and it'd also go to Milford and Devonport. But they also had this tram down the bottom where you could get backwards and forwards from the Bayswater dancers to the Milford dancers. There were buses as well that went across the East Coast Bays to the Picturedrome and would go. So every show would finish at 11:30, so you could go home. You can see in that Bayswater dance in the 60s, TV's now showing in our supper room. So that was another great attraction that you could see. What happened to the Takapuna Yacht Club? Well, it's still there today. You can go down and have a look at it, but it's just basically falling apart. And the reason for that is, unfortunately, that original gift that the government made of the land said that you could never make a profit on the land. So once it began becoming dilapidated, you couldn't really set up a cafe to make money to fix it because you can't make a profit. So it's just sitting there decaying away. But it was a real heart of the scene, like Benny Levin, who was a young musician growing up in Devonport. He was one of the sort of people in the 40s who made it famous, 40s, 50s. He had a little band in Devonport, and then he was invited to be the resident band, and he set up like an 8-piece orchestra, and then he took that orchestra over to town to St. Seps and became one of the main bands, and then he went on to become one of the main promoters. So it kind of shows how important people in the local scene went through these places. What changed though, of course, was the Harbour Bridge in 1959. Suddenly the whole thing of catching ferries across and it being like a far away part of town, or like a exciting holiday home, sort of changed overnight with the Harbour Bridge being built in 1959. And so you'd get little venues in the style of the day, more sort of rock and roll venues, which was the sound that was coming through. You can see in that ad for the Delmonico that it's advertised as being just 5 minutes over the bridge. So it started being like drive over and see a band instead, since no one was drinking, obviously, because it was illegal to drink at these places, 6 o'clock closing and all that. Yeah, I mean, briefly on that, that subject is that, like, it goes right back to 1881. They made the first major licensing law in New Zealand, which set that it was like 10 o'clock closing then, but the main law was they wanted to separate entertainment and bars, because the temperance movement saw having entertainment, especially dancing girls and things, or billiards even, in your bar, was you're attracting people to become alcoholics and drink more. And so they made this law that said bars could not have any of that. The one thing they could have, though, was they had to have 6 rooms of accommodation, because they really needed accommodation then. So from 1881 onwards, bars were just part of a hotel where you just drink for a certain period of time. In 1917, they changed it to 6 o'clock. They wanted the troops to be home with their family after drinking. So that was 6 o'clock closing. That went right through this period. So drinking was completely separated as far as the law was concerned from entertainment. In 1919, actually, they almost did entire prohibition, and it was going to pass, but the overseas votes came in of the troops overseas, and that's what actually stopped complete prohibition being introduced. So instead, you know, you had those cinemas that I talked about earlier, but you also had these little sort of coffee lounges. I mean, you can see the Delmonico, it's just along from where the Bridgemere Cinema is in Northcote now, but it's really just like a lounge. I mean, that bottom left photo I just put in so you could see that it's really just the floor of a normal house. There's no like raised stage or anything. Yeah, and they just sort of play. There's no PA as such. A lot of these would have been Shadows-esque kind of groups. And if there was a PA, it'd just be a speaker with a microphone. The cool thing about the Delmonico was that a young lady called Rosalie Edmondson, who'd grown up in Liverpool, had come to New Zealand and was living in Devonport. She'd finished school and become a dental assistant. She was very excited to go and see the Beatles play, and she yelled up the pool during their concert at the town hall, and they were like, "Oh, we've got a scouse in the house." But she was singing one night at Delmonico, just getting up to sing with the band. She sang La Bamba, and the owner said, "Oh wow, this Rosalie girl is a great singer." And so he signed her up as her manager, told her to change her name from Rosalie Edmondson to Sandy Edmonds because she had nice blonde hair. And she sang that song that I played at the beginning and became like a national star. So that was one of the early North Shore pop singers. Meanwhile, the Picture Drome back in Milford, because it had that history, kept going as the heart of the North Shore live scene. So the Picture Drome became the Surfside Ballroom, which was like a lot more sort of rock and roll variety show type club. There was a real separation. I guess it was a real teen sort of audience that would go to these sort of rock and roll events, whereas the grown-ups would go to sort of cabaret late night things, sort of with dancing girls, and it was a bit more sort of adult. Yeah, Surfside went right through to the late 70s. It was a really long-running venue. Like bands like The Dudes played the early shows there and stuff, and so it was really important. Meanwhile, way in the end of Beach Haven, this sort of relates to the alcohol laws, I think, originally, because you wonder why a ranch house would be so popular when it was so far out of the way. And it was because people would just roll up on the ferry with crates of beer and be able to drink, and the police wouldn't be able to get there. Such a long drive to go and bust people for alcohol. It was also an era where there was heaps of like really popular live venues around the Waitakaris, because if one of them got busted, they'd ring the next one and warn them. And so there was a real effect of the distance stopping the police being able to bust them. But what happened in 1967 was they finally changed the alcohol laws and pushed the closing times back to 10 p.m. and they loosened up. You could start having entertainment, and there were different law cases that argued that even underage performers could perform as long as they weren't drinking. And so everything changed overnight. It also, between 1917-ish and 1967, there was also a law that no woman could work in a bar unless they were family members or owners. So that was the time then that changed. So it was a real manly kind of place. But of course, what happened was immediately all the big breweries got involved and actually ran their own bands and started clubs, and that went right through from the 60s to the 80s. So you can see these places like the Esplanade, which we will talk about later in Devonport, as a DB bar. New Zealand Breweries, which would be Lion. You can see the Lion down there, ran Mondesir in Takapuna, and the Lion Tavern in Devonport. Some of these bands were even started by the breweries or brought over by them. I don't think you can read this. Nightclub was the top of Shore City in Takapuna. The Korean Kittens, brought over from Las Vegas. So they were kind of importing these shticky kind of covers bands. And then there's more Lion bands along the side there, Spinfield being one that they toured a lot, that was sort of a Lion band as such. And as I said, way back in 1881, there was that connection between bars having to have accommodation. So a lot of the places that had licenses already, which could then extend to 10 p.m. closing and get bands in suddenly, were hotels. So a lot of the places on the North Shore that first came out as the big venues were motels and hotels. So one of them being the Milford Marina Hotel, which is a simply massive place that went through right to the 80s and had some of the big bands of the era. Buddy Wilson and some fellows playing there. Similarly, the Pounamu on the other side, near Onewa Domain. You can see Ray Wolf and the Avengers advertised playing there. So it looks, I mean, it doesn't look like the coolest venue, but it became like a really popular kind of spot, even through the fact that like Suburban Reptiles, the punk band, did their launch there and stuff in the 70s. So it was quite a wide variety of people who had to use these kind of uncool spots. Mont Desert is one of the big ones though. That's, you can see it's a very cool kind of early 1900s build. And it went right through really. It became really big in the 80s and 90s. You can see Beaver playing there with, who's on drums? Can't remember his name. Bruno Lawrence. Yeah, and all the big bands played there, the Dudes, DD Smash. Later on, you'd have the Exponents play there. When it finally closed in the 90s, they just had a run of huge bands like Push Push and Street Talk and all these bands. It was a really well-respected venue. So the odd thing about it was that it usually closed at like 11 o'clock in the 80s. And in the 90s, it only ever extended to 1. So Takapuna had this kind of limit on it, whereas you sort of thought, oh, well, Takapuna will be the next spot, because Milford, by then, now people were driving from the motorway. Takapuna was closer to the motorway and much more accessible. So Takapuna really took over from Milford in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, 90s. But it kind of had that peak, especially when dance music came in the late 80s and early 90s and clubs were opening later and later. The fact that bars closed at 11 and then 1, it just wasn't enough to have a whole night out. So people stopped going there. Windsor Park Hotel is another weird one. I mean, it's right in Maringi Bay. It's like, I mean, it would have been, behind it would have been strawberry fields, literally. Like, I used to live there when I was sort of 4 and there were strawberry fields right there. But because it was a hotel and it had a bar, all the bands played there. So that's the Dudes playing there. You can see the Crocodiles played there too. So it kind of paints another history of where the North Shore could have been a cool sort of place, and one of these places could have continued on, but they're all kind of limited. Some were sort of purpose built. Glenfield Tavern is in that top left photo. You can see the mall in the middle, and Glenfield Tavern is sort of bottom left. Massive car park, just built sort of in suburbia, but not in a like great spot really. And same with Thunderbird Valley Inn, North Harbour Arms. Ian McGann, who ran shows at that time, said about Thunderbird Valley Inn, in those days you could go to the pub, as we did, for 2 hours every night and drive home happily. Obviously that encouraged big barns like the big pub called the Thunderbird Valley Inn in Glenfield, which held around 1,800 people. So you jam them in there, bands like Tommy Adderley and the Chicks, and have a bloody good night. So what he's referring to there really is you could just drunk drive, so it didn't matter. You could have these very uncool locations. The first legal drinking limit was late 60s, and it was 100 milligrams, which is double the current limit. So you could drink about 4 pints of beer if you're a man over a couple of hours, or about a 6-pack. So it was a very high limit, and also it was very hard to test. Until the 80s, you couldn't test the blood. So you'd have to see someone, the police would have to see someone driving very poorly and then actually test them. And someone told me that in the 60s, they knew someone who got pulled over. They were obviously drunk, and the police actually just drove them home, just led them home. So it was quite a while before that connection. It is funny to think that all those people drinking massively before 6 o'clock closing in that hour, getting massively drunk, probably drove home. And then, but maybe when bars started closing at 10 and there were more and more people, more and more accidents, finally in the 80s, they sort of closed that down. But yeah, I mean, Glenfield Tavern just became seedier and seedier, I guess, but it's Postman's Leg now. It's quite a fancy sort of gastro pub, I guess they call it, across from the mall, still there. The Shoreline, I mentioned the nightclub earlier where the Korean Kittens were playing at the top of the Shore City. James Brown also played there when it was the Shoreline, which is quite odd to think of in the middle of Takapuna, which just shows how Takapuna could have been this cool place if it wasn't for those sort of restrictions of being seen as being in suburbia and having to close earlier. It was called Jaggers and Kicks as well. That photo on the bottom left is just a little mystery I thought I'd mention, which is it's a photo of the Cossacks apparently playing at the Shoreline in Takapuna in the 60s, but I don't think the Shoreline was there then, and that's not when it was called the Shoreline. So I think they might have actually had an event at Milford Marina Hotel called the Shoreline. I saw a little mention in a bit of ephemera that suggested that, but it's just one of those like peculiar things where you're like, what? This, I don't understand. So very frustrating for a historian just to have like a couple of different mentions. I've tried to email Chris Parfitt, who was the singer, because the Cossacks went on to be the High Revving Tongues, which were quite a famous band, but I haven't heard back yet to clarify. But people's memories of 60 years ago are quite faded, I found. Recently, I had one where I was trying to find out about the Polynesian Club on K Road, and I talked to Bernie Allen and Merv Thomas about it, and I asked Bernie first who was there, and he said, oh, Merv never would have gone. He was married then, and it was quite a seedy place. And Merv was like, I've totally played there heaps with Bernie. So it just sort of shows we need to ask these questions whether people can still vaguely remember. So I mentioned the Esplanade earlier as a DB pub. I mean, it was built such a long time ago. It's like mid-1800s. Still there on the corner at the bottom of Devonport. Still has bands there, even more sort of quiet sort of covers bands or blues bands on Sunday afternoons and so forth, or Caitlin Smith. But in the 80s, it had all the big Flying Nun acts and sort of post-punk bands of that era. So it was actually like a very active, cool part of town. But Devonport really didn't quite get going either. So when you had the kids of the people who'd moved to the North Shore to live, they started their own bands in the sort of 70s and 80s. So you started to get more musicians coming through. But oddly, bands like the Screaming Mimes, who came out of Rosemary College, that's them playing in the Rosemary College art room, rather than playing the venues of the time, they hired halls, like they're playing at a netball hall there. So there was a real disconnect between the young bands and those sort of venues, which were seen as sort of really the sort of pub. Pubs were kind of uncool, and also the drinking age being 20, it meant it was really hard for young people to go and see bands. So there was still a lot of underage sort of venues around the place and cafes and so forth. As part of this also, you could also include probably Don McGlashan. He went to Westlake around this time, came out of that scene. Peter Ruder, who played in Dee Dee Smash, he was actually in a band with Don McGlashan before he went on to be in Dee Dee Smash. And there are other bands like the Ainsworths. Adam Holt, who went on to run Sony, was in the Ainsworths. No Tag. So there was a whole scene, and there was like articles and Rip It Up about the North Shore invasion when they played in town and so forth. And Screaming Mimes got to #1 on the charts, so it was a real scene for a moment there. But yeah, as I mentioned, the North Shore never really got going as like a little bar scene. I think because of those closing hours and just being a bit far away, town still being seen as cooler. In more recent times, I kind of wondered whether Albany with the students there might build up a music scene. But I think, it's just seen as such a suburban place that it's never really taken off. Shore City, where that Shoreline venue was, is so run down now. If you go in there, it's like a real sort of sad spot, but maybe one day. Instead, what they had in the 90s, in 1992, they opened the North Shore Event Centre, which is down the bottom there, at a cost of $6 million. So it's a massive place where like Blur and Tool and all those big bands played in the 90s. Not used quite so much anymore, often more used for sort of sporting events like the Breakers and stuff will play there sometimes. But, you know, some amazing events have happened there. I mean, Darcy Clay, when he supported Blur at North Shore Event Centre, he recorded his version of the song about Princess Diana. He did a version of English Rose, he called it, which is his version of the Elton John song, which was released on his final EP. And funnily enough, Darcy Clay came from Northcote College, which is also where Dave Saunders came from, 3Ds. So musicians were still coming through. Bands like Nothing at All, the punk band, who members of which went through to be in the D4. They also came up, but they played, once again, just halls and so forth. They didn't really play the bars in that area for the most part. But you did have the Bruce Mason Theatre, which was built in 1996, top right there, right in the heart of Takapuna. So there is a kind of cultural heart, but it's a lot bigger sort of scale. So bands like Fat Freddy's have gone back and headlined there. The Student Radio Awards were held there for a couple of years. So it has had a lot of music, but it's not really at that sort of grassroots level. Though one thing that's been consistent since the 70s is the Devonport Folk Club. It was originally started in a basement of the old Devonport Methodist Church and run by a Scotsman called John Sutherland. So that was in the 60s. But in 1965, this chap, Roger Giles, met the secretary, Sonia, and fell in love with her. He was an Englishman, but he loved folk music. And so in 1970, Ted Jackson, the mayor of Devonport, offered Roger and the people from Devonport Folk Club the use of this bunker, which is one of the old wartime bunkers on Devonport, on Mount Victoria, I should say. And so the folk club's been held there weekly since then, basically, and Roger's been involved most of that time. He went back to England for 4 years at the late 70s, but aside from that, he was involved right through to his death in just last year, or 2020 actually, he passed away. So I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's quite amazing. It's worth at least going once. They do play the kind of folk that's very sort of over the hills and do-do-do. It's very like traditional folk. Don't expect to see anything like cool and modern. It's very traditional, but it's an amazing little venue with not really any windows and just concrete walls. But it has been important. For example, this chap on the top right there, Finn Andrews from the Vales, one of his first shows when he was 14 was just going up to the folk club and playing with the bands there and trying out some of his own compositions. Fortunately, he met this chap on the right there, Ricky Morris, who was setting up a studio. There was actually a place down the bottom of Devonport called the Depot, which was an arts area. And Ricky Morris started a studio there called The Bus, and he recorded Finn Andrews when he was very, very young. And Finn Andrews was kind of almost sort of giving up on music after a bad session at RockQuest. But he used those demos to go to England and sign to Rough Trade and become an international success in the indie music field. When he was in 7th form and 3rd form at Takapuna Grammar were the Czechs. There's very young retro rock guys on the bottom left there who were inspired. You know, once you go to school and you see someone in your own school who goes overseas and records in big studios and signs to overseas labels, suddenly changes the bar, sets the bar higher, and you realize, oh, that's possible. I mean, Finn Andrews sort of knew it was possible because his dad was in Shriekback and a lot of sort of UK bands, so he already had that sort of knowledge of music. So the Czechs followed and created their own scene coming out of Devonport, and they took over the Masonic Tavern, for example. One of the guys from Greg Thwaites, I think his name is, from the Lils, this 90s band, was the bar manager at the time. So when the Czechs came in and wanted to play, he was like, oh, great, I'll do anything I can for you. They were like, the alcohol laws are changed in 1999 to go down to 18, but they still wanted, they were very young, they were like 15, 16, so they still wanted their friends to be able to come see them. So what he allowed them to do was he got a special license where he could have afternoon shows in the top bar, unlicense it so you wouldn't sell alcohol, and all young people could come for 2 hours and see bands in the afternoon. Then the chicks would come back in the evening and play in the main bar, and people would buy alcohol, and he'd make his money back from that. So it was a very supportive kind of scene. A Masonic Hotel was another one that was built in the 1800s, but when it became apartments, it was listed, and so it had requirements to it, but when they took it over for apartments, they made changes sort of following the suggestions of the listing, but it got to the point where the people from the Historic Buildings Trust said that it had been changed so much that it's no longer listed. So they can do whatever they want now. Basically, they sort of ate away at it and ate away at it to the point where it's not worth anything from a heritage point of view anymore. And it certainly doesn't have any more gigs. But to go back to Takapuna Grammar, we're certainly not finished, because even though there was that shore core bands like White Birds and Lemons, the Czechs, Early Birds, Electric Confectioneers, that era. Meanwhile, while they were getting to the end of their high school, at the intermediate next door, Belmont Intermediate, Ella was performing as a 12-year-old and being scouted by a record label at this very young age. And yeah, was picked up for a record deal, sent round to people like Ricky Morris and other producers to see whether she'd fit. Finally met up with Joel Little and Royals and went to the top of the US charts and so forth as Lorde. But there she is performing in her first, well, one of her first bands, which is Ella and Lewis. And they're playing at Devonport, which is another part of that Devonport scene that really supported. So they had their own recording studio, they had the Masonic Tavern, and they also had this yearly festival called Devonport where they could all play. So it was like this whole like microcosm of the scene for a little while there. And even someone like Lorde came out of that. She recorded at the bus as well. Well, actually at the depot once Ricky Morris had gone, so it was no longer called the bus. She had a band called And They're Masked. And if you look them up on Bandcamp, the album's still up there, and one song still features her as a very young girl singing weird indie music. So yeah, that kind of shows how it could have been possible for there to be more of a Devonport scene. So I'm going to kind of wrap up. This is just a short talk, but we can discuss more. But I mean, I've just flown over the scene. I mean, obviously there's a lot of other things, a lot of other venues. 2 examples there that I just find as I go through. Every time I look through the old Auckland Stars for something, I discover some new random venue I've never heard of. The Riverboat Restaurant on Como Street in Takapuna with Paul Lester on multi-instrumentalist Paul Lester, which is kind of funny because his name comes up so much. He's someone who recorded an album at the High Diddle Grill in the late 50s. And so that's in the 80s. So it's like a 30-year long career. He could play like violin and I think piano, accordion as well. And he played at the Paunamu in the 60s. And so he's just this like continual sort of loungy presence, providing a bit of background music. This one, the Lighthouse in Birkenhead, I don't even know where that was, but it's rock and roll with all the greats. There's also the one down by, people have told me that down by the ferry terminal at the bottom of Birkenhead, there was a restaurant down there that sometimes had music. So there's all these sort of parts that you can't really cover. And I'd be remiss if I didn't cover my own school. Rangitoto College had plenty of like famous people when I was in very first started there. Push were in 7th form at the school, and they played in the school hall. They recorded themselves as a video for the Shazam video competition, did Volts 220 and won their first sort of little bit of money as a band. And they got to #1 on the charts with Trippin'. And then you have Concord Dawn, who had a worldwide dance music hit with Morning Light. And then Naked and Famous, probably one of the most famous, and they got to one of their albums got to the top 50 in the US. That's how big they got in the end. And the main guys from the band, not Alicia, but the other ones, came from Rangitoto College. So there's a whole history if you really get into all the musicians that have come through, but I couldn't really cover that in a talk like this. It goes on till today, of course, as well. You know, there's bands like Emoji and Hans, the rapper, who come from Rangitoto College. And so it's still a lot of people coming through and affecting the music scene. But it's still kind of a weird zone. I mean, you have places like the Brownsea, which have big bands like the Exponents or Feelers might play there and stuff, but it is weird how there hasn't been like small bars coming through and so forth. So North Shore is an odd case, but I think it's quite representative of changes to the Tamaki Makaurau scene over that time.